Good morning. Welcome to Endocrine Lecture 2. I appreciate your patience with me this week as I get ready for this conference. Hopefully this will be relatively painless for all of us. So we're going to finish up talking about the endocrine system right now, starting off from where we left off on Tuesday with the pancreas. While you all were in lab yesterday, you saw a couple of different slides that showed the pancreatic islets or islet cells, and those are pretty difficult to see on a microscope. So I've added a couple of slides here so you can sort of start to see what they look like when they're a little bit more like the slides that we see here, as opposed to the perfect nice ones we see on Google image search. The sections that are highlighted with the black circle are the actual islets, and then everything around that, so around here, those are the acinar cells. Same thing here. These are all acinar cells. They look like happy little trees, and just sort of crowded around. And then inside, there's a pretty obvious difference when you look at it from low power or 100 times magnification. It's a little harder when you get up close. So acinar cells are exocrine cells, meaning that they release digestive enzymes out that will eventually leave your body. So they go through a duct and they leave your body. Whereas those islet cells are endocrine. They produce insulin and glucagon, which we've talked about pretty extensively, that we'll talk about a little bit more here. When we're talking about glucose homeostasis, in glucose homeostasis, let's say, for instance, that you eat some food. Eating food directly increases your blood glucose, and because of that, your pancreas detects this increase. The pancreas then releases some insulin. The insulin will then go to many different targets, one being your adipose. So this will take your adipose or go and convert some of that excess glucose in your blood, or fatty acids, depending on the food that you ate, and it will turn that into triglycerides for storage for use later if you need it. The liver will take the glucose and it will make it into glucagon. Glucagon is that sort of spiral-shaped glucose polymer that you saw in 109, that is the storage that animals use for all glucose. And also, the insulin will tell the somatic cells that now's the time to take up some glucose, so you might use a symport and do that secondary active transport process, take up some more glucose into the cells, all to get it out of the blood. All of those things combine to reduce your blood glucose so that you come back to glucose homeostasis. If you skipped a meal instead of eating food, then your blood glucose would decrease. So the pancreas again would detect this change. It would release some glucagon instead of insulin in this case, and it would use that on several different targets again. The glucagon would affect the muscle cells, and it would start hydrolysis of some of the proteins into amino acids. This is called gluconeogenesis. Woo! Gluconeogenesis is just the breaking down of those long proteins, and it means that we're breaking down muscle, but we're getting some food out of it that we might need because our glucose is decreased. Sorry, that's my cat. Just ignore the banging noises behind me. So we also might have some of that glucagon go to the liver, and the glucagon then tells the liver to start breaking down glycogen, and the same with the adipose cells. So we're going to take those triglycerides, break them down into glycerols and fatty acids. The glycerol has to go into glycolysis, and the fatty acids actually can go sort of more directly into energy for most cells. It can be used either as pyruvate or acetyl-CoA, depending on the part of the fatty acid, and sometimes just right away can be converted into ATP. So all of those things are broken down into glucose. The glucose goes into the blood, and the blood glucose increases. We're back to glucose homeostasis. That's the basic negative feedback loop of glucose in the pancreas. Okay. So moving on to the adrenal gland, which we also saw slides of. There's a little diagram over here, so you remember adrenal. Adrenal's root word is renal, whereas renal means kidney. So they're a gland that's just above the kidney. We have the cortex and the medulla. We know the different parts of the cortex. We'll talk about those as we go through. So the adrenal gland has some direct ties to the hypothalamus, where the hypothalamus will send a signal to the anterior pituitary. Anterior pituitary, the signal itself is a releasing hormone that will tell the anterior pituitary that it should start producing adrenocorticotropic hormone, so that ACTH that we've talked about a little bit. The ACTH will go to the zona fasciculata in the adrenal gland, and the adrenal and that zone will start to produce cortisol. Cortisol, we mentioned, is specifically for increased nutrient mobility. But some of the specifics of how that works is, this is much like when we talked about blood glucose. It's going to increase hydrolysis of triglycerides in the adipocytes. It's going to tell the liver to break down some glycogen, turn it into glucose, and then tell some of those skeletal muscles that hydrolysis of muscle protein might be necessary. It also suppresses the immune system. You need all of your focus to be on the stressful event that is in front of you. So all of those things combine to make you ready in case that something happens and you need to, run or fight. If you have a disease related to this cortisol secretion, there are two different types. You can either have hypersecretion, as in hyperactive too much, and that would be considered Cushing's disease, whereas Addison's disease would be hyposecretion. Addison's disease in particular, it can lead to little to no reactions to stressful situations or inability to act in stressful situations, so that can be pretty dangerous. So moving forward, we have the zona reticularis. So the zona reticularis is partially mediated by the adrenocorticotropic hormone. There are some other things that can make that happen as well. Some of them are sort of unknown. But the zona reticularis in particular produces androgens, or testosterone specifically, a type of androgen hormone. Testosterone is responsible for sex drive in adult females. It's also helps to supplement testes in adult males. And remember that this isn't the main location that we get testosterone, because it's mostly secreted in the testes. We just get small amounts of it that can be secreted via this area of the adrenal gland. All right, couple more left, almost done. So in the glomerulosa, we have the ability to detect the sodium and potassium levels in the blood. If there happens to be a decrease in sodium or an increase in potassium, then the zona glomerulosa is going to release aldosterone. Aldosterone increases the loss of K+, or inside in the urine, so we're going to release more of it from the body. And it also decreases the sodium loss plus some water in the urine. Now the medulla is a special case. The medulla actually is mediated directly by neurons that go from the hypothalamus to the medulla itself. And those neurons dictate the fight or flight response. The medulla releases norepinephrine or epinephrine. Epinephrine in particular is called adrenaline in some areas. I'm not really particular about which one you use as long as you're consistent. In most countries other than the US, people call it adrenaline, but we use epinephrine. So epinephrine and norepinephrine combine to increase the heart rate, increase blood to skeletal muscles. Your pupils will dilate, amongst other things. And these all are preparations to get you so that either if there's a situation that calls for it, you will either fight for your life or run away as fast as possible. So you need to be prepared for whatever might come. Looking back big picture, when we're talking about this interaction between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, this is a response that's mediated by releasing hormones. So we call this a hormonal control. I'll give you a little bit more detail about that on the next slide. Over here, these guys are, it says hormonal control, but that is actually humoral. So Humoral, humoral. Humoral control is, think about like the humors. If you've ever read some history, they used to think that all human life was mediated by these humors. And the humors mean that we're detecting some sort of response in the blood. Okay. And then last but not least, we have this nervous control, where nervous control means there's a direct nervous stimulation that releases some sort of hormone. I'm going to go through that again in just a second, so don't worry if it's not exactly clear. Okay, so starting from the beginning, hormonal control, so these trophic hormones that we've been talking about. Hormonal control specifically is when the endocrine gland releases some sort of hormone because it's stimulated to do so by other hormones. Okay. An example of this is just like we mentioned, so when the hypothalamus is telling the anterior pituitary that it needs to start producing some cortisol, or it needs to tell the adrenal gland to produce some cortisol, it's going to do that by releasing hormones, specifically releasing hormone that activates this area, and then that ACTH, which activates this area. So both of these situations are a hormonal controlled regulation of hormone release. Also, when we were talking about the thyroid gland is activated by TSH. TSH is released by the anterior pituitary, so a hormone that tells another endocrine gland to activate. Okay. We also have some nervous control. Nervous control is when the nervous system tells the endocrine gland to release hormones. So a couple of examples of that, neither one of them new. So if there's some sort of stressful situation, the hypothalamus will tell the medulla directly to release epinephrine, norepinephrine, and then that will mediate your flight or fright response. Flight or fight, not fright, sorry. And then also suckling in an infant. Suckling like the act of suckling will send a signal to the hypothalamus, a nervous signal. The hypothalamus will then send a signal via the nervous tissue of the posterior pituitary, which is a storage area for oxytocin. Oxytocin will be released into the mammary glands, which will release milk, leading to more suckling. So this one actually has a positive feedback loop that's mediated by nervous control. And then last but not least, we have humoral control. So here's the spelling in case I butchered that while trying to say it out loud because it was wrong on the other slide. Endocrine glands in humoral control respond to substance or levels of those substances directly in the blood. So increase of glucose, decrease of glucose, the pancreas detects that in the blood directly, and that leads to the release of insulin or glucagon, depending on what is needed. We also talked about the parathyroid gland, the parafollicular cells, and how they mediate calcium. Those that should be calcium 2+, sorry, and those levels, calcium 2+, are detected directly in the blood. So the levels of those substances in the blood are direct. So that is all of the lecture today. So pretty short, pretty sweet, pretty direct. I know I went through it fast, but you can listen to it as many times as you need to. The Canvas quiz will be posted on Canvas under the endocrine model. The password to get to the quiz is ENDO, E-N-D-O, all in lowercase letters, just like the beginning of the endocrine system. There are 5 questions. They'll be worth 5 points. At least one requires that you listen to the lecture directly. If at all possible, try to do it on a computer. Tablets and cell phones can be kind of glitchy. You have computers available to you on campus. I may not be available for technical problems. I will try to be if I can. But the help desk is available to you, so you can call them as long as you do it early enough. So if you're tech unsavvy, you might want to go and do it early enough that you can get their help if you need to. You have 2 timed attempts. There will be no late quizzes, so make sure you do it early enough to help you if you might need it. I'd suggest going through it or going through all of the info, make sure that you understand it, do the quiz, and then as you're doing it, maybe write down what the questions are so that you can do it a second time and make sure you get it perfect. That's the bonus of having 2 timed attempts. It does mean you need to know the info before you do the second attempt, but if you don't do well on the first one, that's okay. It's going to take your highest grade anyways. So I hope you all have a really great weekend. I will look forward to seeing you on Monday when the week's not so crazy, and thank you for listening.